we may work for the same client because I worked for the protein division of one of the largest privately held companies
I
as
think
a
we've been
client.
there. But I mean,
Yeah.
that's a differentiation. That's something that's going to make a market. And so that adapt is critical.
Hi, I'm Matt Egol, host of the CX and Culture Connection, the podcast for leaders looking to drive impact by focusing on their customer experience and culture together. I'm excited to be here with a longtime friend, Steve Kunkle, who I've known since his days leading the customer success team at SAP. And he's now the founder of Mainly Governance. And we're going to have a really great conversation today talking about how customer experience and major tech investments go together. Thanks for joining the podcast, Steve.
Yeah, I appreciate that, Matt. Great to join and looking forward to the discussion.
Some people may be wondering, what does SAP and major technology investments have to do with customer experience? I think a lot. We're going to have, because a lot of big investments, whether it's SAP or Salesforce or Adobe or Qualtrics or other platforms, some are bigger tickets than others. But, SAP is definitely one of the bigger investments companies can make. Huge impact on the work in the company, on the customer and the employee experience enabled um, across lots of functions: marketing, sales, operations, finance, and also the e-commerce and customer relationships and call centers. It's all enabled by technology. So where do you see technology fitting into the customer experience, and from your days at SAP, and tell us a little more about Mainly Governance.
Sure, Matt. I appreciate that. So mainly governance is focused on really what I think is the moment that matters in the relationship with providers, SaaS companies, customers, getting ROI on their investment. And Matt, I really kind of got charged by this back in my days when I was at Coca-Cola, and I took over what was a struggling program, an SAP program at Coke. And, I sat in and kind of started meeting with these partners, and it became very evident very quickly that they were really about themselves and what they could do and less about myself, and what needed to get done. And so, I really felt a bit stranded by that governance environment and said, I got to reset this thing. I've got to reset it around. I mean, I was on maybe a third cycle of deployments. It wasn't the first one. It wasn't innovation. It wasn't what's the art of the possible. It was, we really need to get this thing going. So, you know, that experience hit me pretty hard. And so when I think about customer experience, it isn't, customer success and success plans and all those things. It's really about the experience and how it makes you feel. And so, one of the things when I look at these programs, and certainly in my career, whether it's been in industry, as I said, with Coca-Cola or from SAP and having many roles and working with a host of customers, it really, when you start to think about how does it make you feel, because a lot of times these governance programs tend to be feeling transactional and, get things done. And it's really not about how am I getting buy-in from the community. There's training and things, yes, you do in software. But that being said, it's like, what's the experience the customer's having? I'm sorry, and the end user. And what does that look like? Am I buying into it? Do I see my future? Is it something that I'm seeing as proactively something that's adding value to where I'm going? And it really needs to be managed, and it needs to be something that's evident throughout the program. Because if you think about it, I mean, this is something that typically a software program would do some capability for these end users, for these leaders. And so that frees them up to go do other things. So what's the opportunity? What's the thing that excites me about what's next and where I'm going as a result of that? So, commitment in my mind is reciprocal. And if the program doesn't think about the experience and it being a positive experience, not just in the technology, but in what's created around it and where I'm going with it and how that's helping me in my career, that commitment's going to be less than ideal. So really that customer experience and paying attention to it as not only a part of the program, but as an ongoing endeavor as you continue to deploy and to, drive the program forward, it's paramount to making sure that it's going to stick and that the opportunities with the software and beyond are actually captured and driven and realized.
when we're talking about value here and how to kind of make sure that all the parties involved are aligned and how to make sure the value gets realized. That's whether it's the companies like Coca-Cola or whoever the brand or the manufacturer happens to be. There could be a SAP or Adobe or Salesforce or whoever the platform is, and then there's the delivery partners like an Accenture or PwC, where I did work at PwC helping with some big programs across all those platforms, where I was being brought in as a kind of the culture and change guy, um, putting that spin on customer experience and employee experience to realize value. Um, and but what's interesting about this is there's two ways to look at value. We've talked about this. One is baking it into the plan for how you implement SAP or whatever the platform is, so that there's a clear value case about why you're investing. And then there's also the actual experience of the company implementing it. Like that's more of your customer success lens and making sure it doesn't go off the rails, because there's a customer experience of the company. So if you're brand X, it's your end customer's experience that you're implementing in your employees, but you're also is your experience implementing the platform and making sure it doesn't get screwed up, because you could waste a lot of money and in terms of like things taking longer, more, cost overruns or just a whole bunch of issues. So, did I get that right? Or are there other ways you think about value?
No, I really do. Even in the words governance and with programs, you tend to narrow into what is the thing that gets done. And to your point, the first definition of value, what's my ROI on this investment and how am I going to get that? But I think companies are making a commitment in the thinking around why they're doing the program into a long-term capability for the company. And that's only really going to be realized through that experience and it being a positive experience, it being a motivating experience, and being something that's a differentiation that moves them forward. So you're spot on, Matt. It really is, and it's something that it needs to be managed as a part of the program. It's something that you really have the opportunity to set the baseline and begin to think about how does that move forward. And it sounds like you obviously did that as a result of the programs that you were involved in. So that's really critical, I think, to sustaining the capability beyond efforts to it becoming a true way of working, a way of doing business, which is ultimately what companies are looking to do.
And mainly governance. Obviously, you focus a lot on governance, and maybe share a little bit more on why governance is so critical for successful technology investments in platforms like SAP or Adobe, Salesforce, or whatever.
Sure, Matt. So I'm going to share a visual here, but let me just like baseline governance. And I had a recent experience. It's my governance of an individual project. I was building a buggy for two of my grandsons, and the ROI was to see this buggy. It had a car and beeping, and all that, to see the joy in their faces of something I knew that and really believed they would enjoy. Well, in starting that, I needed to have, well, were the instructions clear? Did I have the tools? Did I have the capability to actually put this thing together? And I don't know how much you've done of those, but they aren't necessarily trivial. I rushed and thinking, oh, I got this, and screwed it up. And I had to buy parts and, reset things. And ultimately I got to the ROI. We had a great time with my grandsons, but it just goes to show in very simple environments, the ability to kind of have the right practices, the right tools, understanding that this is going to deliver the outcome is paramount. So when you think about governance structures, and so if you look at the governance structure on the left, you now have, as you talked about earlier, you have providers, consulting providers, software providers, and the customer themselves, all with different practices, all with a definition of success that isn't necessarily always the same thing. And you tend to bring, you want to, the beauty of that is you want to bring the best of what you have. But if in that complexity, if you don't take the time to think about, well, how does that come together and how do we operate as a cohesive organization, it becomes very fragmented, very siloed, finger pointing, so a lot of the things that tend to derail, as you said earlier, causing cost overruns, losing, eroding value, losing trust, the experience goes way down. So it really, the governance moment, and it's not just the business review of governance, it's the work around it and getting alignment with all of the great capabilities those three entities bring to the table, looking at it both operationally and as a strategy on how do we really drive success, and then ultimately making sure your leadership is committed and driving and creating the culture around it. It really is kind of the moment. I mean, there's a lot of things that can go wrong, and things go wrong in programs. It's just the nature of a program. So the ability to kind of have a governance with visibility, action oriented, results driven, is really paramount to making sure that I get the outcome I want. And the thing about that also is it's cyclical. So you don't tend to do everything all at once. You might do, a foundational element, and then there's innovation, and you come back and do it a second time, and then you need sustaining capability. So you really need to think about what is the cadence I'm going to run. What are the types of cycles? How much can I absorb? How do I really define success? How do I build capability? And that's a part of the governance process. So that is really why I call it the moment that matters, is that's going to make or break a program. And so having some maturation, some capability to bring that together, as opposed to a lot of governance structures I walked into tended to be off the rails. And it was clear the governance was fragmented. There was no cohesive view of how to get things done. There was no absorption of best practices and, relying on each other. The accountability was not clear. So it's a complex problem, and there's a lot of moving parts, but the ability to kind of pull that together in its fundamental form really kind of drives either you get to something efficiently or not. And it starts with governance.
So I'm sure there's some fun war stories to share about where things went wrong or what you had to do to fix them. Before we dive into some of that and some other questions, I know you and I have talked about the importance of kind of building alignment up front and making sure you kind of set things off the right way. I want to share with the audience. Stick around to the end of the episode. There will be a QR code that you can scan for, for brands, for manufacturers, not for consultants or tech companies. Happy to chat with you, but offer is for the brand manufacturers that are going through this type of a journey. Steve and I are offering for the first 10 companies that respond, we'll set up a free discovery call with the two of us with you. So it's a great opportunity. We'd love to hear about the issues you're facing with governance and making your program successful, and how to connect that to customer experience and change. And we're happy to spend a discovery session with you for free. So definitely check out that QR code at the end of the episode. So Steve, you've been talking about governance and why it's so important. When things go wrong in governance, Steve, why is that? What happens, and what do you do to course correct?
Yeah. So, if you can look at the model that's on the left, the complexity, what I tend to see is accountability is not clear. There's implied accountability. So because, as in my old role, I was a software provider, the software was the problem and I was the issue. And so, one of the things that you have to look at from accountability is like culture, it needs to be managed. And so accountability is based on engagement. And so there's ways to look at making sure, yes, there can be accountability, and yes, there needs to be accountability, but it needs to be well-defined and based on engagement so that it's something that can be actioned and taken care of. So there's a lot of finger pointing typically in programs that get off the rails. There's also, I think, kind of a different view of success. And what I mean by that is one of the entities, and I'll pick this time on the consulting company, they want to be seen as the North Star, because they typically have a lot of insight, a lot of practices on what good looks like. And it's really based on an agenda of what success is in their world, and making sure that they've got the right staffing, the right capabilities on site. And so that may or may not be in the best interest of the program and the customer. I can pick on the customer as well. When I've seen governance fail, the customer doesn't recognize that they need to change. The customer's view is, this is something that's here for me, and it's the way I do business and the way I work. But the world is changing. And so the customer tends to have to relook at their internal practices. You tend to see things from a customer perspective of a breakdown between the business and IT, where the business says that's an IT program, or the IT says, well, the business isn't engaging. And so that tends to be a big breakdown. But, just the ability for customers in their internal organization to truly think about how are they going to adapt. And I think for all three, the one thing that I saw lately, Matt, certainly in the last several years, is the introduction of cloud capability. We're used to maybe models where you bought software and you had releases and that was what you worked on. The innovation in cloud is rapid. the practices of staying on top of innovation, of actually doing the thinking about what is a release, it's drastically different. So, the if governance doesn't reflect the reality of rapid innovation and cloud engaged deployments, it's going to fail. So those tend to be the types of themes that I would see coming in, and things that were typically a part of the significant problems inside of programs.
We talked a little bit earlier about alignment on the outcomes and making sure you get that right up front. What does it mean to create a unified outcome story? That's a phrase you use a lot. So I'd love for you to explain it to the audience and not let me explain it, but have you explain it. And why is it so important to effective governance?
Yeah, let me give you a bit of a horror story on a goal that in some ways we thought was the goal, a unified goal, and it wasn't. So, one of the things that I think we have to keep in mind in governance structures is it is people driving the activity. Yes, there's practices. Yes, there's all ways of looking at how are we getting the right results, but it's people driving the activity. And I can think of customers where we said, well, what's the outcome? And typically it may start with a customer saying, I don't see the value. I just don't see the value. And in doing that, a natural reaction is, well, you're in this industry and the industry cares about this. And, this context, this is what keeps CXOs up at night. And this is what your 10K says. And that's all well and good. But if you don't understand that that person, that individual has an objective and an outcome that is what success is, you've missed the mark. And, this particular case was one where there was an individual who was looking to get buy-in from their peers and their budget was getting significantly cut. And value to them was taking some of the implementation costs and deploying it to other parts of the business because they were seeing value. And the stakeholder, because of the nature of where the solution was coming from, was holding the budget, not getting all the value, tight budget, and needed to kind of get alignment and get buy-in from leadership from a financial perspective. And so if you don't have that as a starting point of that's what a goal is, that's what the unified outcome of what everybody should be working towards, you're not going to have the right mark. And so that's one example of, starting with a unified goal that's personal and can drive commitment back to our experience of making sure that it's relevant in my world. And I'm not saying that those KPIs and things aren't relevant, but they're a context. They're not necessarily the end goal. The other thing is when you take then that unified goal of what is success, that now says, let's say that now success isn't just about getting defined value out of a particular implementation, but it's now alignment and leadership, all of the stakeholders. And so when I think about the right side of our governance stride, all of the best practices of where is the customer relationships? What are the customers doing with those organizations today? What's the software provider's capability of being able to engage outside leaders inside of a program that may have looked through one function? How does the software begin to think about how do I not only understand the transaction base and who's doing what, but where the value actually sits in the organization? So it starts to say, if I don't have an ability for those three stakeholders to focus on that one end game and then bring my best practices to bear, and then we as a unit drive as a cohesive group to be accountable to ensuring that's what success is. It isn't a go live. It isn't, the things that sometimes get things off the rail. So it's a way of not only making sure there's a personal engagement and it's something that people actually feel a passion on inside of the customer and on the team, but then I'm also bringing the best of my company to bear. And I'm thinking about, it may not just be deploying the software again. It's creating an environment, it's creating an engagement model with stakeholders that says, I need everybody at the table beyond what appeared to be this one functional deployment. So it really is a rallying cry, not only in making sure that we're clear about value, but how do I bring the best of my company and then architect it in a way together that I have one way of working and I have one outcome, and it's clear from operational governance to leadership governance that there is one definition of success, there is one clear accountability, there is one way of working. It's the best that we can bring to bear, and it's going to happen, and we're going to celebrate it.
To create value, I think the most basic thing is you get beyond just having a system of record, having compliance, having basic, CRM and ERP functionality that essentially takes an old process and makes it more measurable and more controllable. But effectively, that is not changing the way the company works and pushing it. So there's always a tension here between adopting and adapting about like if it's a platform like SAP or Salesforce, SAP or Salesforce have a point of view about what leading practices are, and they've invested in software. And if you adopt all the leading practices of the platform, it will stretch the company to do new things and requires a lot of change to implement all the new ways of working. If you adapt the platform to be more way the company wants to do it, the risk is you end up paving the cow path and doing things the way they did it. Or equally bad is you have way too much customization and the cost of ownership goes way up and you waste a lot of money and the program goes off the rails because you can't execute. So how do you manage that trade-off about like adopt versus adapt and striking the sweet spot?
Yeah, I think the lens is there. If I start with adapt, adapt should be around differentiation. So, companies, let's say that I'm a company that my customer interaction and the way that my customers work, and it requires me to deliver my products in a certain way, let's say. That's a differentiation for me to be relevant in the market that warrants adapting and saying, I need to keep these practices. I worked with customers in the protein industry, and the way that they looked at an animal and the way that they thought about the value of that animal and the actual meat from that animal, if I could use that as an example, was a differentiation.
We may work for the same client because I worked for the protein division of one of the largest privately held companies
I
as
think
a
we've been
client.
there. But I mean,
Yeah.
that's a differentiation. That's something that's going to make a market. And so that adapt is critical. But that's where it stops. And so, but adopt, equally to your point, you can't then say, well, we're going to throw all this out and now we're going to go do this, because an organization typically can't absorb all that change depending upon their level of sophistication. And so that's why I continue to think about governance as cyclical, that there may be a foundational element, and maybe I have to keep some of that because I can only absorb so much capability. But in phase two, that's getting eliminated. So it's really a matter of, in adopt, is it a differentiation that really it gives me value as a company and in the market, and is something that is kind of what my brand warrants. And then from an adopt, it's what's the clock speed I can work to, and how quickly, and the realistic ability of the organization to absorb the change, recognizing that it may be 2 or 3 waves, but that you don't plan for this thing you keep in wave one that's going to stay forever. It's ultimately going to get earmarked to get removed. And I think that really gets the right conversation on the table to try and, to your point, fundamentally say, I'm not moving this old stuff for the sake of moving the old stuff. That's a value in and of itself of getting rid of that. And it's a barrier to particularly in a cloud overall, right? A barrier to future innovation.
Well, you know what? Like I like to say, Steve, that all paths to value must lead through either CX or EX, even if they're growth versus or cost. It's impossible to create value without touching either customer or employee experience. Um, and but the way to create value for customer employee experience is not survey metrics. That's one barometer. Ultimately, it has to move some business outcomes, but those business outcomes link to CX or EX. So how do how do you think about like the role of customer and employee experience and making sure the program is designed and the governance is good and that it's actually delivering meaningful change on CX or EX so that it's a real successful program?
Sure. I mean, again, if we go back to how does it make me feel? What is the impact on me, myself, my job? If I think about adapt, it's probably an organization that feels very proud of what it is that they've developed and the ability they've been to drive value out of that partnership, let's say, from a customer, and they don't want to lose that. They don't want to now all of a sudden feel like they're going backwards. So, and hopefully inside of that innovation differentiation, there's actually some things that they've wanted that you could get. And so I think that's something that, taking probably an organization that's feeling very proud of what they've done, because it is a differentiation, and injecting enthusiasm and future innovation to just take it to the next level. And then when you think about adopt, I think when you take a cyclic nature of adoption and you say, you know what, it's important that we get to where we need to be, but I'm going to be respectful of where you're at. And I'm going to be respectful of the change that I'm asking you to take on. And so I'm going to cadence in a way that we're going to walk with you, and we're going to we're going to take you through that process. Here's the end game. So it's an exciting end game, but it's not a light switch. You don't flip it on and off. It's something that now you're going to say, I'm going to walk with you. We're going to actually, as we take steps, we're going to validate that we're doing the right things. So there's also some feedback on from an employee adoption, from an employee experience that I could take in and say, what could we do differently? So the next cycle, it's actually even better and more respectful of that experience. So I think, Matt, you're spot on. The people, it's about the people and the ability of people to drive and to ultimately get the company where it needs to be. And so I think when you think about those two levers, the CX experience and the EX experience is paramount to making sure, because it's going to define clock speed. It's going to be something that's going to energize and create the opportunity and sustain what's being done, as opposed to it being a tool that's thrown out there and tell people to use it, which would be the worst approach.
One of the things I've always enjoyed talking about with you, Steve, is dating back to when you were leading customer success, is that there's a journey, not just that the company's end customers are on, but the company itself is on to implement. The program is a journey, right? So, and I'd love to talk about how governance evolves over the stages of the program. We talked about like thinking about the moments that matter along the customer success journey. So let's take a minute. I'd love for the audience to see a little bit more about some of the mastermind groups that I'm leading with some colleagues that help them on their learning journey to go on the learning journey with others in their organizations and other peers in other organizations. The mastermind groups are a way to think about engaging in your learning journey. And then we'll come back on the other side and talk about how does governance and the work you do help improve that journey for the companies. Allow me to briefly interrupt the podcast to share an invitation for you to join one of our mastermind groups. These groups are for leaders building out the CX function at their organization. They are for culture champions looking to develop and sustain behaviors that bring their organization's mission, vision, purpose, and values to life. I'm excited to team with Randy Rothenberg, former CEO of the IAB, on a mastermind group focused on experience as a winning marketing strategy. I'm teaming with Tamar Cohen, who has led CX and EX teams at Zoetis and Travelers, on another group focused on CX EX alignment. Each group meets monthly for 90 minutes. Members receive a coaching hour each month and can attend quarterly workshops. Go to JourneySpark's website for more information. Please DM me on LinkedIn with any questions. Now, let's get back to the podcast. Steve, I've been really enjoying our conversation about how technology investments connect to better CX and EX programs and how to realize more value through more intentional focus on governance.
Mhm.
Um, Before the break, we were talking about the journey. How does the focus for governance evolve along the stages of the program?
Sure. I mean, if you think about, I used to think about the customer journey leading customer success organizations as a line. Like you start out with, okay, in the world we were in working with customers, there was a commercial negotiation. There was, all of the work that was done early on to talk and to weed out who's this provider I may want, what are the things I'm going to do, is your software a fit, all those things. And, that was the beginning, quite honestly, of the experience. But the pivot from negotiating and kind of agreeing who's on the team to playing is radically different. And so, when you think about the journey, there's kind of a key pivot from commercials into actually executing the governance, and then having upfront an agreement to the governance, the participants, again, thinking about who owns the outcomes, is it personal, all the things that we've talked about earlier. So you kind of baseline, the things that are going to be the foundation way of working, so that you're setting yourself up for success in every company involved, and those participants around the governance. And then you go through kind of the journey that I think you probably begin to start to do in any program. And that is, am I ready for this? What's it going to take? What are the things that are changing? What's the things I'm going to adapt, the things we talked about earlier. And that's kind of a readiness. And it's beginning to design and to think about the blueprint of, what's going to matter. But also equally important than that, what tends to happen in governance is that's seen as, let's say, a project manager doing a deployment and doing an assessment of functionality, and they bring in key people who are decision makers. But they don't think about, what about the people that are going to ultimately support this? Or what about the end users or the change that may be required around the capability. So the involvement in readiness beyond just what looks tactically like the right people for the right decisions is really important to set up the governance itself, because the journey is going to go from readiness to ultimately a delivery and implementation. And again, in thinking about readiness and adapt and adopt, you start to think about, and which is typical for large programs, multiple cycles of implementation. Or if you have a cloud solution, there's going to be ongoing innovation. Am I going to have a budget and a process for looking at future innovation post go live? So there's all these things that you really want to set up from a readiness. And then, unfortunately, a lot of times go live is seen the end of the journey. I think everybody says, hey, go live is not the end of the journey, it's the beginning. And so now you begin to think about um, managing outcomes. If I'm going to say there's value, how did I set myself up a baseline for capturing where I'm at today so I can say that it is incremental value or not for whatever those outcomes are? And then how do I sustain that outcome? And what are the changes that I need inside of the company and inside of the partnership and the way we work? And then it's almost like you cycle again. Now that you put a capability in place, now you can go to the next level, let's say, of capability, and you go through the cycle again. So a journey is important to have structure because it can create discipline and create ways of ensuring that you're bringing the right practices together and you're capturing the right content and putting the right processes in place. So that methodology is important, but recognizing also that you're going to do that turn probably many times and that it's going to become a way of working is equally important. And so that journey is a circle, not a line. And so I think that's as you look at the visual we have here, you start to see that it is, whilst you have the first interjection perhaps into from a leadership perspective, it becomes something that really has specific work and specific activities that you want to do, but you want to do it in a cyclical way, recognizing that capability is improving with each cycle.
I think you're raising a really good point that um, you don't have to wait for the pig to come out of the python for all the value to be realized, right? Um, but like there are also things that, and this is some of the way I've engaged with digital as and customer experience as part of SAP and other programs, is I often apply what I call like and I've talked about this in the past on the podcast, like green, yellow, red approach, where something that's green is out of the box, something that's red is really hard to do, and something that's yellow, you can either make process changes, um, you can do workarounds. Hopefully, it's not chewing gum and wire, right? But you can make changes with yellow. There's a certain amount of yellow stuff you can do before the organization's bandwidth is overstretched, right? But don't just apply the green, yellow, red to prioritize the achievable program, and then that could be multiple increments of the program, as Steve was saying. But you can also come up with things that you can do that are easier to do even before the SAP goes live that you can actually do sooner. But you have to do them in a way it will not work at cross purposes of what you're building towards in terms of your data and your user experience. But there are some things and this is where your stack comes together. Like, what are you doing with agentic? The solutions could be in SAP, they could be in Salesforce, they might be outside of it with other partners. Maybe your agency's doing it for you. Maybe you're building it yourself. And folks could check out by the way, my Substack article about Welcome to the Creative Economy that I wrote with Randall Rothenberg, which is all about we're all builders now and we're all embracing agentic. And you can do stuff really fast. And so that's an interesting dynamic now is it's more iterative. It's you could have increments to the program, but you could also have things you're doing in a more agile way. It's like multimodal, multi-year cycle versus get it done in 3 months.
That's a great point, Matt. I mean, I think about even in customer success, again, with a methodology, let's say from a software provider coming in with particular moments that matter, as you mentioned earlier, that we developed and we rolled out and we drove our success around. Agentic is significantly changing what happens inside of those moments, significantly changing. You used to spend a lot of time just pulling information together and doing whatever. Now you have the ability to kind of take a lot of things and have it delivered for you. And now it's about the conversation, which we always wanted to be with the customer or with the partners or with inside of the governance. So it was more about the conversation and the agreements, but all that time that used to be spent to trying to get kind of the insights and the information available it's a changed game. It's a new world, and that should be something adopted for those that are looking at providing a service into these types of programs.
Yeah, for those who don't know, maybe haven't heard me on the past podcasts, like I'm Randall Rothenberg, and Randall was a guest on a previous episode. So definitely check that out and like and subscribe so you don't miss other podcasts like that. But Randall and I are advisors to agenticadvertising.org, Steve, which is a new trade association. It's more of a professional association, actually, for standards and member education and really driving collaboration in the industry. We're all builders. So it's for brands, publishers, agencies, and tech, not just tech, to embrace agentic for how advertising connects to customer experience. And this actually is really important to what we're talking about with tech platforms, because a lot of the data signals that are used to optimize agentic come out of your tech platforms and how you stitch together your platforms. So those data signals come out of your platforms, and you're innovating and developing a lot of these tools on what used to be called low no code platforms, that now it's essentially vibe coding with agentic. But I would encourage people, like, don't think of advertising as separate from commerce or separate from operations. The signals, both demand and supply signals, have to go together. In the future, one of the most important signals to optimize your advertising will actually be, is it in stock, right? Which is coming out of SAP, not coming out of your advertising, CDP. So Steve, we've been talking a lot about the journey and about the importance of governance and how mainly helps engage leaders in the organization to build alignment with their other partners. So how do you think about the way leaders engage in the journey? Like what's in order to improve the outcomes? And this is really the connection to culture and to change management. How do you think about leaders need to engage in the journey for it to be effective?
Yeah, just quickly, Matt. So if when you look at mainly governance, there's three things we're focused on. We're focused on that sales to ops area, which is from a leadership perspective, a significant pivot from, okay, I've made my decisions, I've done whatever negotiations I need, but now, as we talked earlier, we need to get to practices and success platform that says this is what we're going to go move on. So sales to ops is one service that we do. The second one is what we call cold eyes, which is, one of the things I looked at coming into governance was, could I go in and see the story, the leadership story, what am I doing from the content that's there? I'm not asking people. I'm looking at, what is the execution? Is it telling me the story, the one goal, from a leadership perspective that I can actually look at and say, okay, I got it. I got what's going on here. So that's a second thing that we focus on. And the third is kind of the governance health, which is, again, making sure that it's sustainable, making sure that we have that cohesive look and ability to execute together. And that is something that's going to establish our ability to be cyclical and to drive things in cycles. And the reason I share that is from a leadership perspective. If leaders, I think what we're looking for is engaging with intent. So, is there, from a personal commitment standpoint, again, and typically early on from sales ops, that pivot when we're now going into where we're driving a program, is the personal commitment there? And is it something they're actively engaging and actively operating on, whether that's the CX, the experience side of it, the program side of it, the decision-making side of it? So that's really an important way for leaders to think about, how are they engaging? Are they engaging with a personal commitment to ensure success? And it's not that they're involved in everything, but it's evident that they are. The second thing is, and it's kind of this cold eyes look, is shared accountability. So am I holding myself accountable? Because a lot of times you come into these, particularly when governance isn't working, and it's finger pointing. And so am I taking personal accountability? And that's every leader. And that's a leader from the customer side. That's a leader within the consulting partner, the SaaS partner. So from a leadership perspective, am I taking an accountability? Am I holding each other accountable? And am I doing the things that need to get done in order to drive success? And then from a third perspective, the reason we look at governance health is, as a leader, it's important to think about the decision making and where the decisions are being made. Are leaders allowing decisions to fall on individuals that, quite honestly, don't have the capability to make those decisions and implement those decisions? And so, we think about leadership. It's where are the decisions being made? How are they being made? And are we learning? Let's say that we made a decision, or a decision was made, it wasn't the right way to make the decision, and we're making sure that it's changed and decision making improves going forward. So, I really think about, from a leadership engagement, am I personally committed? Am I showing up with intent? Am I ensuring there's accountability, myself included? It's a team. It's something that's, we're going to need everyone in the boat for us to get where we need to be. And then, are the right decisions being made timely so that the program be effective and efficient as it can be? And so it's really that engaging with intent that you can see, again, in those injection points that we tend to look at as a fundamental requirement of these programs to really move forward.
We talked earlier at the very beginning of the podcast about how there'd be a QR code at the end. Here it is, for folks to be able to, uh, set up a free discovery session with the two of us. I'm looking forward to doing that. Steve, what should folks expect if they sign up for this? What would they get out of the session?
One of the things that I think is really important for mainly governance, I know for yourself, is, where does it make sense? Where does it make sense to engage, and what are the things that really would be the right focus? So from a discovery session, it really would be an ability to take a step back and almost take that cold eyes review, if you would, that I talked about earlier, and looking at what are the challenges and what are the capabilities that are believed to be on the ground, and then allowing us to take a look at the artifacts, the specific things that are going on, for us to, again, to see, do we see alignment? Do we see opportunity? And it may be, it's a coffee conversation of, hey, I really think you need to think about it. Or it may be something where it's like, this is really foundational to something that needs some course correction. And it's something that we could help with, certainly. And so it really, is about making sure that everybody, ourselves, and certainly those that take this opportunity in this discovery, is to take a look at things and say, what really makes sense, and how do I get moving forward? Certainly the customers, in my program, and what's the insight I can get from this time together.
Thanks, Steve. I've really enjoyed our conversation. It's a lot of fun chatting about this a really important issue. I often say it's not just about the technology. You got to pay attention to the people and process and the culture. It's in the name of the podcast, but technology is really important. And what we're talking about here is actually being sensitive to the way your leaders show up, the way you engage on the journey to make the technology investment successful. So we're not saying it's all about the technology. It's about how you get value out of the investment in the technology.
Yeah, I appreciate, Matt. Thanks for having me on. And these programs, there's a lot of good things going on. I know we're talking about challenges, a lot of good things going on, but those challenges can be the game changer to get you where you need to be. And certainly would look forward to working with you to do that.
Yeah, so let us know about the discovery session. And if folks want to get in touch with you, is LinkedIn the best way?
Sure, that would be perfect.
Okay. Thanks again, Steve. You sparked a lot of great ideas for me. I'm sure you have for the audience, and look forward to the discovery sessions together.
Thanks, Matt.